International Film Festival. Tell us what we have to look forward to this year, Cliff.
We have a pretty robust lineup. We've got big films sort of start to finish this year. Some big films that kick off the festival, including tonight's Destroyer. We have John Goodman tomorrow night. Totally sold out, so please don't try and come, unless you already have a ticket. We have films like Ben is Back, Boy Erased. All of these things are sort of front-loaded, and then at the end of the festival, we got such films as Roma, which has gotten lots of Oscar buzz, which is a last-minute addition to the festival. Green Book, If Beale Street Could Talk. A lot of really high-profile films that we're really excited to have as part of the festival. But the thing that we are here for is to actually expose St. Louis to films that they might not otherwise encounter. And that's the American independent films, the documentaries, and particularly the international films that are great. There are some of the best movies in the world, and yet they don't typically play theatrically here in St. Louis. And so that's what the festival is all about. Encouraging people to take chances on films that they haven't heard about in advance, but sound intriguing. You read the description and say, yeah, that looks good. I'll give it a shot.
So what's your favorite on the lineup this weekend?
Well, I program documentaries, so I will lean heavily in the direction of documentary. And we have two great ones actually at Washington University screening for free. And they will both be very likely on the short list for the best doc in the Oscar race. Quite likely to be among the 5 nominees. One is Crime and Punishment. It's a plus sign, Crime plus Punishment, which deals with racial profiling in New York City and the cops, Hispanic and black cops, that sort of rebel against that and fight their own department. That's a really terrific film. That plays actually on Friday night, on the 2nd. And then on the 4th, on Sunday night, we have, in my estimation, maybe the best documentary of the year. It's hard for me to say because I love all of the films that we feature in the fest, but it's called Minding the Gap. And it's just an exceptional movie. Deals with skateboarding, domestic abuse, racial issues, small town America, and the problems that pertain. It's a whole bundle of different kinds of issues that are addressed, but it's a very intensely personal story that you will be moved by, occasionally amused by, and you're almost certain to cry at least once during the course.
So we can look forward to going through all the emotions. Is there anything else you would like to add?
Just come out and take a chance. That's really what film festivals are all about. Not just sort of staying in your zone. Oh, I've heard of that movie, I'll go to that. No, don't do that. Go see something that you don't know anything about and just sounds intriguing. I should mention, however, that we do have several locally oriented documentaries that people should definitely make an effort to see. And one is Where the Pavement Ends. And it deals with Ferguson and Kinloch and how the two cities sat side by side. And for many years, Ferguson was all white, Kinloch was all black. And there was actually a physical barrier that was erected by Ferguson to prevent black people from going in from Kinloch into Ferguson easily. I mean, obviously they could go around and access it, but it's a really terrific film by a filmmaker who grew up in Ferguson, now works elsewhere, but she's coming back, Jane Galooly. She'll be here. Her filmmaker cohorts will all be here. It'll be a really great conversation. That takes place on Saturday of this weekend.
Now tell us a little bit about your film.
Well, my film is a little bit of a prehistory of the conflict that happened in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. And I start discussing and exploring the history of Kinloch, Missouri, which was a black segregated town that bordered Ferguson up into the 1970s, actually. And there had been a closed road between Ferguson and Kinloch. For many years, it was very contentious. And so in our film, what we're doing is we're sort of paralleling the history of a closed road between the two towns and the relationship that Ferguson had to Kinloch. and comparing that story to the street that Mike Brown was shot and killed on in 2014.
Wow. Now, while you were making this film, what did you discover that you didn't know about Florissant or Ferguson or Kinloch or St. Louis as a whole?
You know, the biggest surprise to me was that Kinloch was, when I was growing up in Ferguson, Kinloch was a really large and very vibrant and active community with many, many thousands of people living there. And in 2012, actually, when I started this film, it was actually prior to Mike Brown's shooting. I started this project, and I drove into Kinloch, and Kinloch has virtually been erased. And the town has been razed, and there's very, very few buildings there. And it's shrunk from probably over 10,000 people to maybe less than 100 people. So the biggest shock in this film to me was that Kinloch disappeared, and that was really the catalyst for me making this film, is sort of like what happened to Kinloch, and then fast forwarding all these years later and what happened on Canfield Drive when Mike Brown was shot.
Tell us how important it is for St. Louisans and people everywhere to see this film.
I grew up in Ferguson, and when I live on the East Coast now, and I was watching the news when everything was unfolding after Mike Brown was killed, and one of the first things I thought about was being a child and knowing that this contention existed between Ferguson and Kinloch. And it didn't surprise me at all that there was this explosion happening at that moment in time because of the history. And so many people were going and they were covering the protest movement at that time, which was important, but nobody was really talking about the 50, 60, 70 years prior that explained a lot about what happened. And so I think that really fueled our interest in telling the story from a Kinloch lens, like through a Kinloch lens.
Well, we definitely appreciate you humanizing and also remembering St. Louis, even though you're on the East Coast. We definitely look forward to the film. So tell people out there why they should come to see the film.
Well, I mean, they should go see it because I know that St. Louisans are really deeply rooted in community. And there's, even though the people of Kinloch don't live within the boundaries of that incorporated city anymore, those people and their descendants are spread all over the city, and they still, when I was making the film, there were so many people who said, we might not live there, but we're still kin. And this whole idea that, Kinloch is called Kinloch because everybody is related to each other, everybody knows each other, and they still feel very connected and rooted to the place where they established themselves. And so I think there's a lot of people and their descendants out there who would be interested in seeing the film.
Tell us about your film.
My film is called Destroyer, and it's a crime thriller that takes place in Los Angeles and follows a somewhat grizzled LA police detective played by Nicole Kidman as she works her way through the remaining members of a gang that she was placed undercover with 17 years prior. I'm really excited about the fact that I get to screen the movie here in St. Louis at the Tivoli Theater, where I grew up here in St. Louis, and I grew up watching movies at the Tivoli. And so for me, coming back here is a really big part of coming back to my history. So it's pretty great.
Awesome. Now, is this your first year at the St. Louis International Film Festival?
No, I actually screened my first film called Girl Fight here in 2000. So I've been here twice.
Awesome. Well, we are definitely excited to have you. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're hosting?
Well, this Saturday, November 3rd, I will be hosting a lecture at Webster University as part of the St. Louis Film Festival. It's called The Illustrated History of the St. Louis Drive-In Movie Theaters. This is a talk. This is a lecture. I will be hosting about 275 images of the old drive-in movie theaters that they used to have in St. Louis. I got a lot of these images from like the Warenberg archives and a bunch of old movie ads and things like that. So anybody that went to the drive-in, anybody that grew up in St. Louis in the 50s and 60s and 70s will really relate to this talk. And it's 6 o'clock at Webster University's Moore Auditorium this Saturday. And also, as part of the St. Louis International Film Festival, we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of 5 films that were made in 1968. Rosemary's Baby, Bullet, Medium Cool, Pretty Poison, and Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in the West is my favorite movie of all time, Erica. So they've asked me to host and moderate a Q&A when it's over. Once Upon a Time in the West is the best Western. It's the best movie. It stars Henry Fonda and Charles Bronson and Jason Robards. It's such a great Western. I'm looking forward to people watching Once Upon a Time in the West on the big screen, because I think a lot of people haven't seen it because it's such an old movie, and it's not as well known as a lot of movies. I think a lot of people will show up, and it's going to be everybody's favorite movie after next Saturday. Yeah.
Well, we definitely look forward to it. And what are you looking forward to this weekend? Which film?
Well, that's a good question. I'm a retro movie guy. I like old movies. So I know there's a documentary about Hal Ashby, who was an iconic 70s director, and he directed things like The Last Detail and Harold and Maude, a lot of great movies in the 70s. He's been gone for a long time. But they're going to a new documentary about him, and they're going to show a screening of a movie called Shampoo, which starred Warren Beatty and Goldie Hawn from '76. So I'm looking forward to seeing that at the big screen again. Also, Saturday the 10th at 7 o'clock, they're showing a documentary about Douglas Fairbanks. Douglas Fairbanks was a very famous silent film star from the 20s. And then they're going to show a movie from 1916 called The Half-Breed. And that was, it's a notable film because it's the first depiction of Native Americans in a positive light. And that will be, it's a silent film, of course, but it will be accompanied by the Rats and People Motion Picture Orchestra, which is a local group of musicians that score silent films, original scores for silent films. And every year, Sliff hosts them, and they do a score for a new movie. So that'll be good. That'll be next weekend as well. So a lot of great stuff, but I love the retro stuff.